Hi, and welcome to Train Signal and the continuation of the Windows Server 2012 Advanced Services course. We're turning our attention to trust relationships in Active Directory. Back in NT4, the immediate predecessor of the Active Directory domain platform, you could create a domain, and that domain was more or less a security island unto itself. Users in that domain could access the resources in that domain. I could configure the permission lists on resources in that domain to be able to grant access to users in that domain. But if there was another NT4 domain out there in my network, I had no way to be able to access its resources with my users, nor could its users access the file servers, print servers, database servers, and such in my domain, unless we took the step to create something called a trust relationship. We're going to turn our attention to that technology and a related subject on UPN suffixes. Active Directory differs from the behavior of NT4 inasmuch as in NT4 all trusts needed to be manually created. It required direct administrator effort to be able to create a trust relationship between two NT4 domains. And more to the point, it needed the assistance of both domain administrators in both presumably separately managed domains to be able to set that up. Both parties needed to do the work of setting up work on their end to allow the other side of the connection to be set up properly, hoping that those two pieces fit together, and then communication could flow. Authentications could happen across that trust boundary. Active Directory handles trusts rather differently, inasmuch as many of the trusts that we work with in Active Directory are automatically created. They don't require manual creation. Now, there are a number of custom trusts that we can build for a variety of reasons that will need manual effort of one form or another. But let's talk about the default trust relationships first. The two kinds of trusts we'll encounter by default in Active Directory include parent-child trusts and tree-root trusts. The basic idea is that in an Active Directory domain architecture, in an Active Directory enterprise, we can knit together multiple domains into a couple of different kinds of containers. One is a tree. A tree occurs when I've got multiple domains that have related domain names. My top-level domain is globalmantics.local, and we spin off a new Madagascar subsidiary, and we decide that for administrative reasons it's best for them to have their own domain. They could be madagascar.globalmantics.local. The name logically flows just by adding a new prefix to the earlier domain name. That gives us a tree of domains. What if I want to add a domain to my organization whose name doesn't flow with those other organizations? Some sort of a company that we've acquired. We purchased their company, we own their IT organization, we want to join them into our architecture. Well, how do we do that? I might combine those resources in by way of a separate tree in the same forest. In both of those kinds of scenarios, we have default trusts at work. Parent-child trusts occur in the place where one domain has a child domain under it because, again, of that name structure flow. The child domain incorporates the name of its parent. Those domains will have trust relationships amongst them. And the top-level domain of one tree will have a trust relationship with the top-level domain of the so-called forest root domain, the top-level domain of the overall forest of trees, where each tree ties together domains with related names. Those trusts in Active Directory perform the same basic role that they performed back in NT4, which is to say that because a trust relationship exists, that means that users on one side of the trust can access resources on the other side of the trust. Now, that assumes a certain directionality for that trust. Trusts can be created in a one-way sort of a fashion, where one domain specifically trusts one particular other domain. It's also possible to create trusts that have a two-way relationship, where not only does this domain trust that one, but that domain over there trusts this one. So not only can my users authenticate themselves to resources in that foreign domain over there, but that foreign domain's users can access resources in my domain, assuming, of course, appropriate permissions and things of that sort. But the trusts unlock the door to allow for that communication to take place. Let's take a look at how a tree of domains implements some of these trust relationships. So here I am on server 1. I want to be able to illustrate trust relationship behavior, and I'm going to do that from the main trust administration tool called Active Directory Domains and Trusts. That tool doesn't provide lots of information. In fact, it's fairly sparse, at least here in the mainline GUI. But what I can do with it is I can see the hierarchy of domains that I built in my organization. We can see that GlobalMantics has expanded into its Madagascar location, and we decided to spin off a whole separate domain in that organization. Note that there is a tree structure in operation here. Globomantics.local has a child domain, madagascar.globomantics.local. That is a child domain because it inherits the name of its parent. If I were to spin off an Asian subsidiary, asia.globomantics.local, that would also be part of the same tree. It would be a child of globomantics.local. If Madagascar, for some reason, needs a child domain underneath the main Madagascar domain, it would be whatever that new domain is, .madagascar.globomantics.local, and it would be a continuation of the tree there. So, this tool is called Domains and Trusts. Where are the trust relationships? The easiest place to see them is to go right-click a given domain and pull up its properties. Having done that, we do have a tab labeled Trusts, and we can see that this particular domain has a trust relationship to and from a domain called madagascar.globomantics.local. And we can see that the type of trust is a child trust, sometimes referred to as a parent-child trust. The Globomantics domain trusts Madagascar as its child. If I go look at things from Madagascar's perspective, we can see that it sees globomantics.local as its parent. So we've got a parent trust and a child trust. We have a parent-child trust between the two. It's noteworthy that this trust relationship here is described as being transitive. Now, by transitive, what we mean is that if I had yet another domain, Madagascar has a child domain specific to its capital city or some outlying area in the countryside, then that third domain transitively trusts Globomantics, the top-level domain. The top-level domain transitively trusts that bottommost domain, 2 levels deeper. They trust each other through that middleman Madagascar domain. Transitivity just means that the trust relationship is able to carry through that connection to other domains, yet on the other side of that trust relationship. A non-transitive trust is one in which the trust relationship only exists between the 2 domains that are part of that relationship and goes no further than that. If my organization was large enough here to have a whole separate tree of domains, I would be able to see that my top-level domain, globomantics.local, would exhibit tree root trusts. In that situation, Globomantics would have a tree trust with that other tree of domains over there. Meanwhile, the top-level domain of that tree of domains would have a root trust back up to the top-level globomantics.local domain, the forest root domain. So it's easy enough to see these trust relationships. I can view some degree of information about those trusts by pulling my Properties dialog box. There are options to turn on additional levels of encryption inside of a Kerberos environment to make that environment yet more secure. AES is the Advanced Encryption Standard. We'll be turning on a higher level of encryption of Kerberos communication. And I can validate to make sure that my trust relationship continues to work properly. So these trusts are automatically created. Active Directory adds them by default when you add a new domain to your forest, either as a child domain of an existing domain, or as the top-level domain of a new tree of domains. In either case, these trusts get built. What I'd like to point out next is that there are ways to be able to build entirely new trusts designed to handle a number of unique situations. Those unusual trust situations are described either as external trusts or sometimes as realm trusts, depending upon the context. An external trust is a linkage from an Active Directory domain out to perhaps a classic NT4 domain, perhaps to some other Active Directory forest with which I don't have any other special security relationship yet. We'll address some of those ideas in a moment. And it could be a link between an Active Directory domain and a separate operating system environment running the Kerberos authentication protocol. The Unix Linux family of operating systems does implement Kerberos and can be used in a security association with an Active Directory environment. That means that users of the Unix system could access resources in my Windows environment. Windows users could be granted permissions to access resources on the Unix server. So to make those things work, I'm going to use the new Trust Wizard to be able to make that happen. I'm going to click here to be able to step into the wizard, which wants to know what's the name of the domain that I'm connecting to. And for the purposes of this demonstration, I built on my server 3 a new domain, indeed a new forest, an entirely separate organization from my Global Mantex organization, to represent the scenario where we recently acquired some other company. We thought that they would make a good addition to our overall business. We acquired that business. As part of that negotiation, we learned that they already have their own Active Directory organization. They already have their own forest. And we want to be able to put those pieces together in some fashion. Well, I can do that. I can create an external trust that references that other organization. That organization happens to be known by the name Recent Acquisition Target.com, has been acquired by our company, and I get my choice here of building an external trust or something called a forest trust. External trusts, again, are meant to be for limited purposes. If I've got a new domain coming into my organization, again, I just acquired them, or perhaps it's an NT4 organization, I can build an external trust that references that organization. When I build an external trust, it's worth noting here that the wizard tells me that that is a non-transitive trust. I'm going to trust that domain from this one. Possibly that domain will trust me from over there, but neither of us will be able to necessarily trust other domains in either of our organizations because of the creation of this trust. We would need to do that as a separate manual process. External trusts to NT4 are non-transitive. External trusts to an outside Active Directory forest is non-transitive. Kerberos Realm trusts, interestingly, can be made transitive if you choose to. That's kind of interesting to note. The other option here is called a forest trust. I tend to refer to them as a cross-forest trust to be able to help my memory of what that refers to. What it allows us to do is to take two totally separate Active Directory forests and knit them together in such a way that the forest root domain, the top-level domain of the one forest, and the top-level domain of the second forest will have together between them a two-way transitive trust relationship, which means that the forest root domain of the one trusts the forest root domain of the second, and vice versa. And all the domains in the entire combined set of two forests will all transitively trust each other, because the two forest root domains trust each other. Those two forest root domains trust their children domains, which trust them in turn. Those forest root domains trust the top-level tree root domain of other trees within their forests. All those domains trust each other. This is a mechanism to be able to take two totally separate Active Directory forests and knit them together into one combined organization. Now that does require the Windows Server 2003 forest functional level, which is to say that all the domains in both of my forests need to be at the Server 2003 domain functional level, which in turn means that all of my domain controllers must all be running Server 2003 or later. And if I do that, I can stitch together multiple forests into one combined enterprise network. Let me build an external trust for demonstration purposes, in which I get to choose, is this a one-way trust or a two-way trust? Remember that trusts can have a directionality to them. They can be pointed in a specific direction. The direction that the arrow points when we diagram it points at the users to whom we want to grant resources. If my domain trusts your domain, that means that my resources are accessible to your users. If your domain trusts my domain, that means that my users have permission to authenticate into your environment and gain access to resources of yours. So for the purposes of demonstration, let me do a two-way trust. Here I get to specify whether I intend to do all the work for both sides of this connection all at once, or am I just setting up this side of the trust? I'm going to then get on the phone and go call an administrator for that other domain over there and say, hey, I've done my side of the trust relationship, why don't you go ahead and do the same thing on your end? If I have permissions to do so, if I've got a user ID and password for that other domain over there, I can configure both sides of that process all in one shot. So let me go ahead and do that. It wants to know, who am I in that specified domain, the domain over there, recentacquisitiontarget.com. I'll also apply my user ID and password and click Next. Next important question is, what's the scope of this new trust relationship? How much do I trust that other organization? Now, it might be that this is a company with whom I've been doing business for years. We recently acquired them. We're great friends. Our IT staff knows their IT staff. Everybody trusts everybody. This is going to be an easy, smooth cultural blend between these two companies. I might turn on domain-wide authentication, which is to say that any user in the TrustEd domain can access any resources in the TrustIng domain, of course, subject to permissions. But what if the relationship is not quite so solid? What if these two companies don't necessarily trust each other all that much? There's a merger, but the rank and file staff people aren't sure they necessarily trust the other guys. Maybe you're in a company where corporate management has this funny habit of acquiring companies and 3 months later saying, nah, that wasn't such a good idea, and spinning those companies off as a separate organization again. You might not want to, as an IT person, take on the risk, if you want to think of it that way, of letting these strangers into your network knowing that they might not be there all that long. So what's our option? What if your boss comes to you and says, hey, we just did another merger. I don't trust those people. I'm not sure I want to let them into everything unless they can prove that they need it to get their jobs done. Can we do that? Your answer, of course, should be, well, sure we can. We can turn on selective authentication in our trust relationship with their domain. That way, that does not guarantee anybody the ability to authenticate. I need to go to each individual server in Active Directory that I want to be able to grant access to and turn on the permission for those people on that other side of the trust relationship to have access. In this case, I'm going to throw the doors wide open. I'm going to choose domain-wide authentication. Do I want to do the same thing on the other domain? Is the other domain going to feel the same way about me? And I'm going to say that it is. All that being done, we're ready to create that trust relationship. We click Next. We've done it. We've successfully created a trust relationship between these two domains. We can take a moment to confirm that trust and verify that everything looks like it's working properly. Do I want to confirm on both sides? There we go. We have a working trust relationship. It's giving me some options to deal with domains that have gone through a migration process where I've migrated user accounts from one domain to another, preserving their old security ID in something called a SID history. So we've got some options related to that that they're asking us to consider exploring the details about. We'll go into that at some other point. So we can see that we now have our existing parent-child trust relationship between GlobalMantics and Madagascar.GlobalMantics. But we can see that GlobalMantics also has a trust relationship with RecentAcquisitionTarget.com. It is, you can see, a non-transitive trust relationship, which is to say that if I go look at things from the perspective of Madagascar, I can see that it has no reference to RecentAcquisitionTarget.com. It knows nothing about it. Let's look at another type of trust that's worth your attention. Those trust relationships go by the name of shortcut trusts. Shortcut trusts get created using the same new trusts tool that we just walked you through. The key difference is that this is a trust relationship that creates a more direct connection between two domains that are already in your forest. Domains for which there's already a trust relationship knitting together those multiple domains. So what's the point of the shortcut? The reason for the shortcut is that when I want to access a resource in another domain from mine, that request hits a domain controller in my domain first. My domain controller says, nah, I can't help you with that. Go call a domain controller in our parent domain. And that domain controller says, yeah, that's not my responsibility. Go talk to a domain controller in my parent domain. And that domain controller says, that's not my department. Go talk to a domain controller in the tree root of that other tree of domains that contains the domain that you want to talk to. And that domain controller says, not me. I'm the parent of that domain, but you want to talk to that domain itself. Here's a domain controller for that domain. The request finds its way to that domain controller, which says, great, I can help you with that. What took you so long to get here? In large organizations, back in Server 2003, a trust path of 10 domains or more was large enough to qualify as too big. Such a connection might actually fail because of the amount of time involved in navigating that trust path. The software would fail to authenticate appropriately. So in cases where that's necessary, I don't know if 2012 has a similar requirement. It's one I remember from 2003. In a case where that's still the case, or where users are complaining that when they authenticate against certain distant resources that the connection is slow, I might speed up that process by creating a shortcut trust. where I can explicitly identify that two particular domains that are far apart from each other in the trust path have a direct trust relationship with each other. In which case, the connection will take the shortest possible trip through the trust hierarchy so as to get that user authenticated swiftly. So again, this will be done using our existing trust creation utility. The new trusts tool will be used to create that shortcut trust. There isn't a separate shortcut trust creation tool, if that helps to know. Forest trusts, we saw, was the other main type of trust that I could create using my new trust tool. In which case, I'm linking together two wholly separate forests. Two different organizations are now merging together to form one organization. In that case, I now have a transitive two-way trust relationship between the top-level domains of those two forests, which means, because each of those forests has internal two-way transitive trust relationships amongst all of their domains, that means all domains across those two forests all trust each other. And again, that's a fine solution if I've got two forests that are coming together and there's very amicable relationships between those two different companies. If not, again, I might choose this option of selective authentication, in which, even though I've built a trust relationship between that set of domains, I'm not going to let just anybody from the one domain access just any resource from the other. I'm going to take extra steps to turn on the ability for somebody in that other side of the connection to access my local resources. The last topic I want to focus on in this lesson is something called UPN suffixes. UPN is short for User Principal Name. User Principal Names are an email address shaped format for usernames that Microsoft introduced with Active Directory and that have largely been left by the wayside by many IT administrators. Not a lot of people know about this or think about them, but I think there's a really compelling reason to put at least some of your attention on how these things work. The classic NT4 era username format is the one that you see in the middle of my slide here. globalmantic/C Mallow. Clayton Mallow needs a user account. We'll create a user account for him. We'll take his first letter of his first name and his whole last name and stick them together and append it after the name of the domain. The domain name username format has been used very successfully ever since NT. It continues to work in Active Directory. It continues to work in Server 2012. There are a lot of people who are accustomed to that format. It works well for them. They don't want to change it. And I can appreciate that. An alternative is this thing called a UPN, a User Principal Name. When I create a new user account, I'm actually prompted to create both. And a lot of people ignore the UPN and continue using the domain name username format instead, which again works fine. What's the benefit of using a UPN? UPNs are guaranteeably unique within the forest, which is to say when I create a new user account, if I give them a UPN, Active Directory will do a check to make sure that no other user account anywhere in the forest already has that UPN. And by double checking that, by securing that UPN, I've given my user a unique identifier throughout the entire enterprise network. Where that becomes important is when my user goes to log in. When a user logs in, a lot of users logging into Windows only memorize their password because that's all they need to get logged in. A lot of Windows systems redisplay the name of the last logged on user. As long as the same user is logging in, they don't need to resupply their user ID. The net effect of which is that lots of users quickly forget what their user ID is. In the local network, that's not a big deal, but if I take that user, put them on a plane and send them to Madagascar, and try to have them to log on from one of our computers there, that user will run into the problem that they've never logged onto that computer before. That computer doesn't know their username. If the user does supply their username, they might be supplying it and targeting a domain controller in Madagascar, and that domain doesn't contain that user account. It has a trust relationship with a domain that does, but the user now needs to know their domain name and their username to get connected. globalmantic/C Mallow. So how do UPNs help? Well, UPNs are again unique throughout the forest. When I authenticate against a domain controller and use a UPN, clayton.mallow@globalmantics.com for example, that domain controller can check to see if it holds that user account in its database. If it finds that it does not, that domain controller can go call a global catalog server and determine what domain does contain that user account. And the local domain controller in Madagascar can forward that authentication request to a domain controller back at Global Mantic's headquarters and get that user logged in. And all that happens without the user needing to think about what domain name their user account lives within. Now you might be thinking, hey Mike, you're cheating there. I can see the domain name right there in the email address shaped UPN, clayton.mello@globalmantics.com. Well, that's the name of the domain, isn't it? Well, yes and no. It certainly could be the name of the domain that the user account is in, but it's actually not a requirement. Let me jump to a tool that will help us illustrate that point. I'm back over here on DC1, and I'm back at my Active Directory Domains and Trusts tool. And in addition to the ability to manage trusts by right-clicking my various domains, something else that I can do from this tool is to right-click the root node that says Active Directory Domains and Trusts, pull up Properties here, and I've got a separate component of the tool just for managing UPN suffixes. The UPN suffix is the name for the domain name portion of that email address shaped username. And I can pick any UPN suffix that I would like. Let's say that globalmantics.local is acquired by TrainSignal, and I would like to be able to assign a TrainSignal domain name ID to my new users, and indeed maybe to all of my users. I can add TrainSignal to this list of UPN suffixes, and when I do, that means that new user accounts that I create, and indeed existing user accounts in my organization, can now use either the domain name of the domain that the account's being created in, or some other domain name within my forest, or this UPN suffix. And let me illustrate that. I'm going to jump to the Active Directory Users and Computers tool to be able to illustrate that idea. I could certainly use the Active Directory Administrative Center tool here as well. Let me create a new user account for Clayton Mallow. Now, up top here, I've got the user logon name, and you'll see that that does have a globalmantics.local suffix over here after the right. That is a UPN there. I can do clayton.mallow. And note that when I hit my drop down over here on the right, I've got my choice of creating it either with the parent domain, globalmantics.local, or at TrainSignal, despite the fact that I don't have a trainsignal.com Active Directory domain anywhere in my forest. Does that matter? No, it's fine. Beyond that, here's the classic NT4 style name, globalmantics /clayton.mallow, or I could even make it a more traditional first letter last name. Those two pieces of data, the user logon name portion here and the classic NT4 style name, need not necessarily be identical. Of course, in most cases they will be. Let me create a user account for Clayton. Clayton Mallow's account exists, and he is clayton.mallow@trainsignal.com. If he goes to log on from a computer that's part of the Madagascar domain, if he goes to log on from a computer that's part of my globalmantics.local domain, if he tries to log on to a domain control that's part of the recent acquisition target domain, which I merged into my organization with a forest trust perhaps, in any of those cases, that request hits a global catalog server, figures out where his account actually resides, and sends a login request over there. Lacking that, my user needs to know in which domain their account resides, and they need to be able to type that correctly. So UPN suffixes can be a very interesting way to unify the login process across an enterprise network in such a way that gives everybody a consistent user account format that might well just be the exact text of your user's email addresses. Think about the number of times that a user in your organization has forgotten what their user ID is. That happens a lot. Think about how often a user forgets what their email address is. Probably almost never, because users are sharing their email address with friends and coworkers all the time. How often does a user need to refer to the name of their user ID in Active Directory? Well, almost never. It would be nice if the one thing could be the other. So I hope that helps. We're going to explore lots of other Active Directory topics in other lessons. I look forward to sharing more Active Directory features with you in those lessons.